Hi, this lecture is looking at how to write a good methods in context answer for the AQA specification. This sort of applies to the old specification and the new specification, and with a real focus on studying education. In your education AS paper, you will be asked to assess the strengths and limitations of using a named method to study an aspect of education. The same is also true when you do the A-level paper in education next year. A good starting point when you get that question is to start thinking about what methods are actually being used, what comes to mind, strengths and weaknesses, get them down on your exam paper. Second one is actually the setting as well. So what is the location of this research? Is it going to be done in people's homes? Is it going to be done in the classroom? How are you going to gain access to your participants, or how are you going to gain access to the data? The third thing to think about, I don't know where number 3's gone, is the types of people actually involved. So who will you be needing to give your questionnaire to, for example? Is it going to be students? Is it going to be parents? Is it going to be head teachers? And finally, any issues raised, particularly in the topic being researched. Now, this is really useful when we're looking at things like truancy or racism or sexism or prejudice, because straight away you should think, oh, hang on, those issues are, sensitive topics, or some of those are quite hard to find out about. What issues are raised by that topic. All that information you can quickly annotate around the question and around the item. Okay, so just to get started, can you think of the different education settings for research in education and any issues associated with different settings? I've given you a couple already, like classrooms or the home, because if it was the home, it'd be parents. But what other locations might you have to conduct your research in when it comes to education? Who are the different participants? And again, I've mentioned students and teachers, but there are other people you might want to research as well. Again, any issues around researching those groups of people, gaining access, permission, any ethical issues, any practical issues. And can you quickly identify any general issues with the study or the topic or group? Okay, so that's kind of, like I said, number 4, any general issues that you think can pop up that you're going to have to try and link back to the actual research method in the question as well. So when it comes to education, there are 3 main groups of people that you need to consider, and you need to think about the PET issues involved in the research subject. So remember, I've said before, you must, in your methods in context essay, talk about practical issues, ethical issues, and theoretical issues, okay? So, for example, it says here, pupils, you've got to be mindful in terms of ethics. They've got little power and status in schools, okay? Limited powers of expression, so therefore they might not be able to give you very valid responses because they don't either understand the question or they can't articulate their response. That's a theoretical issue. And obviously they're potentially vulnerable, another ethical issue. Gaining access to pupils, it can practically be challenging because you need to get permission of head teachers as well, which can also be a bit of an issue. Also, parents, practically, not often in school, so harder to contact or observe. And the class and ethnicity of parents may be important in terms of whether they're interested in taking part in the research, the way they speak, will they understand the questionnaire, will they need a translator, restricted elaborate code, those kinds of issues as well. It's also worth thinking about whether the parents are going to be honest as well. Like, are they going to want to be 100% truthful about what's happening, or they're going to try and cover up what's happening? That's an issue of validity. And finally, teachers. So teachers used to being inspected. So in that sense, there maybe won't be so difficult to maybe gain access to observe them. But little time maybe to sit down and maybe go through an interview. So that's a practical issue. Also, teachers, because they are used to being observed, they might also be used to changing their behaviour, which is a validity issue, which is a theoretical issue. So all of these sorts of things, the minute you read a question, you should be able to identify who's going to be taking part in the research, and you should be able to think, oh, hang on, parents, difficult to get hold of. Not all parents like engaging with the school. You should be able to annotate that down, and straight away you're gearing for a level 3 response if you can do that. Second thing you need to consider is where the research is taking place. Okay, so again, I've run through this in class before, but in education there are only a few settings really. There's schools, classrooms, and staff rooms. Okay, the other area you might end up doing research is homes, and that's only if you're interviewing parents in the home or sending questionnaires to the home. So schools, difficult to gain access, or see confidential records. You have to gain permission of head teachers to do that. It may be convenient for researchers to have loads of young people in one place. So like if you want to send out a questionnaire to all students, they can do it in the classroom. But there are disadvantages to that. Like, are they going to be 100% confidential? Are they going to take it seriously? Is social desirability going to kick in? Don't forget classrooms as well. They're sort of owned by teachers. So you'd have to get sort of another level of permission possibly. And again, pupil behaviour can change in classrooms if they know they're being observed. Teacher behaviour can change in classrooms if they know they're being observed as well. And finally, staff rooms. What a fantastic place to gain access to for real valid insight into what teachers maybe really think and feel about particular students and groups. However, definitely not easy to gain access to those places. It would require several levels of permission, and you might even have to sort of deceive teachers, if you like, and maybe the school in order to gain access and see real true behaviour. Because if you know you're being researched, obviously teachers maybe aren't going to be very honest about how they really feel about particular groups of students. Moving on. So one way in order to kind of demonstrate the fact that you're aware of the strengths and weaknesses of a particular method is to compare it against another method to highlight its strengths, okay? So I'm going to run through some of these examples with you, although I would be very clear that you will only get one method in your question, and you mustn't drift into a discussion about an alternative method. You can have maybe 1 or 2 points, but I would not do a whole paragraph on an alternative method, for example. So, for example, you might say, covert observations are highly valid compared to questionnaires. This is because the researcher is undercover, so the participants act naturally and behave naturally, whereas questionnaires, it's much easier for participants to lie on. Great, you've highlighted a strength of covert observations and a weakness of questionnaires. Again, structured interviews are more reliable than unstructured interviews. This is because structured interviews use standardized questions that are asked exactly the same way every single time, which makes it easier to compare and get similar results. Whereas unstructured interviews generally don't have a set number of questions, so it's difficult to draw comparisons. Have a go at these last two. Questionnaires are more practical than think of what method, because, and explain why they're more practical. And finally, official statistics. These are statistics collected by government bodies, agencies like schools, the NHS, police stations, for example. Official statistics are highly representative compared to, try and think of a method that isn't representative, and they're representative because, explain. Maybe you could try and think of some negative comparisons too, as well. So maybe a question asks you, assess the usefulness of using observations to investigate truancy at school. You might say observations are really time-consuming compared to questionnaires because you only have one researcher observing a number of students, so they won't be able to gain a huge sample because it's a time-consuming method. So, again, key things to remember. Be aware of the issues investigating different groups, students, parents, teachers, okay? And please remember the issues around the location of the study. So try and figure out what is the location of this bit of research, particularly if they're group interviews, that's important, or any sort of interview. Are they going to be done in schools, in classrooms? Because are the students really going to behave naturally, or the teachers? Are you going to locate your research, maybe, meet a teacher or a parent in a coffee shop? Is that going to affect their responses? Loads of different issues around location, and you've got to keep on linking it back to the question to get that level 3 response. So, speaking of level 3, just a quick reminder of the different levels of response, okay? So level 1, maximum marks 7. This is where you might make a list of the strengths and limitations of the selected method, okay? So this might be you just discuss the strengths and weaknesses of using questionnaires. A level 2 response, which gives you 8 to 15. This is where you sort of apply the strengths and limitations of the method to education in general, so maybe teachers, pupils, classrooms and schools, but maybe not to the specific issue in the question, so say the question's about truancy or the question's about literacy. You might talk about how questionnaires are very useful because you can get them to a number of pupils very quickly because they're in school. That's a great point, that's a level 2 point, but you haven't linked it specifically to truancy or whatever the topic was in the question. So what we're all really aiming for is this level 3, which is challenging, don't get me wrong, but if you can do 2 or 3 level 3 points, you will get a level 3 mark overall. So 16 to 20, this is where you apply the strength and limitation of the method to the particular issue in the question in item B, because obviously you'll have an item. Now, the items are really useful sources. They generally give you a few hints about PET issues, and they try to link them to the context, so please do use them. You don't need to mention examples of research, but if you do, you will be rewarded where that particular bit of research illustrates the strength or weakness of the method that you've been asked about. So if you do get asked about, observations, use Paul Willis's bit of research, okay, obviously. If you get asked about interviews, talk about Sue Sharp's, maybe interviews with those girls. And there's a range of content analysis. You can look at Angela McRobbie's research on magazines, or using secondary documents, sorry. So, here's an example question. Evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of using postal questionnaires to investigate class differences in university entrance. Now, I've actually got this whole question and the item on the final slide in this PowerPoint, or the second from last slide, so do flick ahead in this lecture to have a look at it and the item. Like I said, to get level 3, the key is to identify how the strength or weakness of postal questionnaires relates to the area of research mentioned in the question, okay? So the points on this slide are both level 1. I'd like you to rewrite them and try and push them up towards level 3. So I'll try and give you a few hints. So here's the bad one. Postal questionnaires are really useful because they allow the researcher to collect a large amount of representative data. However, because of a low response rate, this can affect the representativeness of the research sample. Now that's a level 1 point. Good key terminology, representativeness. It's a theoretical argument. However, low response rate is a real issue with questionnaires. Now, can you think, if you're investigating students going to university, why might students who are going to university at the end of that summer, can you think of why those students might not respond to a postal questionnaire? Try and think, what are students generally up to in the summer holiday between their A-levels and university, and why might that lead to a low response rate? Now, if you can make that point, you are clearly applying your evaluation to the context. So the second one, I'm not going to give you any hints on. So social class differences at university are caused by a wide range of issues. The underachievement of the working class has been attributed to poor socialisation by new right thinker Charles Murray. Now, the issue there, obviously, is there's no mention of the method. Okay, so you need to try and link a point about the method, maybe using some of those arguments, back to the question. So the importance of PET, again, this is something I've mentioned in class quite often, and I've given you a really useful, I personally think, plan there about how you use PET. So the first paragraph, I would always suggest you talk about the positivist or interpretivist debate, which is your theory, okay? You need to be really clear, maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs actually, whether positivists or interpreters are going to like or dislike this method for investigating the topic in the question. This is a real good opportunity for evaluation, because if you identify, for example, postal questionnaires, positivists really like postal questionnaires, and you can explain why. However, interpretivists would disagree with postal questionnaires because they would say they're not very valid. Straight away, you've done a wee bit of evaluation there, and you've covered the theoretical element of your answer. Try and keep focused on the context if you can. So also, have a look at the item. The item generally will have some hints about maybe PE or T points, okay? So is there anything in the item about validity, truthfulness, honesty, representativeness, generalizability, reliability? Remember, those things are all theoretical issues. They're about what's true. So remember to use the item. In the second paragraph, I would suggest thinking about the practical issues of this method being used to investigate the context. Think about where the study takes place, location, gaining access, the time, and the cost of maybe the particular method. And what points can you use from the item? Read the item. Is there anything about those issues that you can talk about? My top tip, though, with practical issues is if you've already argued that the method is a positivist method, that generally means that it's going to be a very practical bit of research, because they generally prefer quantitative data that's generally easy to collect and easy to analyse. However, if the method is interpretivist, which you've already would have argued, then it won't be practical, and you need to explain why this might be, and you can link it to the context. This is where you can get bonus points for evaluation. So you might say, hey, this is an interpretivist method, it's great because it's really valid. However, it's not very practical. That's good evaluation. You're linking your T and your P, and you're recognising that there's some tensions between practical issues and theoretical issues. So paragraph 3 will have to be your ethical issues. around investigating this topic. Is the method going to make is this method going to make ethical issues better or worse? So straight away, you'll have thought about the topic, you'll have thought about, hang on, this is investigating students, you need informed consent. But you might want to think about things like, is this research going to cause psychological harm to the participants? Are they going to have to talk about painful memories? Are they going to think about, oh, my teacher's racist, or my parents didn't try hard enough to get me into a good school? Is that going to upset them? You've got to think about confidentiality and anonymity. Now, don't forget, in a group interview, you can't guarantee confidentiality or anonymity because there's a group of them, so they know who's taking part in that interview. And again, does the item mention anything helpful? Finally, paragraph 4, what other strengths and weaknesses can you think of for this method? Okay, this is your point. Anything additional you think you can make an argument about, and try and link it to the topic. Conclusion, quite simply, you need to argue whether this method is good or bad for investigating this particular topic. And I've given you an outline of a possible sentence structure, but try and back up your judgment with some evidence, or you draw on the essay you've made to say, this is why I've come to this judgment, but try not to use I. So this is an example of a question that's come from the brand new Sociology AS specification. Anyone who knows about the old specification will notice that you are only given one method. You don't get to choose. And the language has changed very slightly. Instead of saying assess the strengths and weaknesses, it says evaluate the strengths and limitations of using self-completion written questionnaires to investigate unauthorized absences from schools. The key words here are evaluate, but also apply material from item B. They want you to use the item more. Every time the examiner comments, they don't use the item enough. Okay, so please do have a go at this question. The second questions on here are from the old specification. Again, new specification, this year's your AS 2016 summer exam, you will only be given one method to choose from, not two. But it is worth maybe having a go at writing the essay for one of the methods, and then maybe having a go at writing the essay for the other method. And I've given you another example of the old specification there, but these are all available on the AQA website. Just Google AQA past sociology papers, and it will take you to the site with all the old specification. It's more difficult to find the new specification paper, but I've sent you guys all the link to that one. Thanks for listening. Bye.